Night in Las Vegas, New Mexico was not quiet. Wind pushed dust along the wooden streets. Lamps burned low in the saloons. Laughter, shouts, and piano notes rose and fell like a storm. In the middle of this storm stood one man with a badge on his chest and a gun on his hip. His name was John Joshua Webb. He watched the street with tired eyes. He knew every doorway. He knew every drunk, every gambler, every man who carried a hidden gun. People called him Marshal Webb. Some spoke his name with respect. Others spoke it with fear. A few whispered it with hate. Inside one of those saloons, a dead man lay on the floor. His name was Michael Killer. A short time ago, he had been alive. Now there was blood on the wooden boards and silence around his body. Webb had fired the shots. 3 bullets. Fast, sure. He was the law. He said it was duty. Many in the town did not believe him. This was the moment that would change his life forever. But the story of John Joshua Webb did not begin here, in a saloon full of smoke and death. Once, the West would call him a lawman. Later, it would call him an outlaw. But long before the gunfights, the jailbreaks, and the headlines, his story begins in a quiet part of Iowa. With a boy who had no idea what the West would make of him, John Joshua Webb was born on a cold February day in 1847. He was just one more child in a very big family. 12 children, one small house. From the start, life did not give John any special gifts. There was no rich land, no big city. As he grew, John watched his father struggle, watched his mother hold the family together with worn hands and soft, tired eyes. He saw how the West was always calling to people. Neighbors packed wagons. Horses were loaded. Families moved on, chasing a dream of better land and better days. John's family moved from Iowa to Nebraska, then to Kansas. Every move meant leaving something behind. A friend, a field, a small piece of childhood. Inside, a quiet storm began to build in John. He did not say it out loud, but the thought grew stronger every year. There has to be more than this. The frontier was changing. Railroads were growing. Buffalo were disappearing. Towns were rising out of the empty plains like sudden bursts of noise and light. John watched men ride through covered in dust, guns on their belts, stories in their mouths. They spoke of Dodge City. They spoke of money, danger, and fame. To the older men, these travelers were a warning. To young John Webb, they were a promise. He did not want to be just another son on a crowded farm. He did not want to live and die in the same circle of land, under the same tired sky. The world was big. The West was wild. And John felt a fire in his chest that would not go out. In his early 20s, he made his choice. He left no fancy goodbye, no long speech. Just a young man stepping away from the safety of his family and into the teeth of the unknown. He took any work he could find. Buffalo hunter, miner, wagon driver, surveyor. Each job was a lesson. Each mile toughened him. He learned how to read the land, how to ride for hours without speaking, how to sleep with one ear open. He learned that in the West, men respected strength, speed, and nerve more than anything written on paper. But the West also tested him. He saw men die over a card game. He saw drunks shot for one wrong word. He saw bodies buried in shallow graves, the wind quickly wiping away the only proof they lived. At night, by the campfire, John's face was lit by orange flame and cold stars. He looked older than his years, not because of time, but because of what he had seen. He did not talk much, but inside, his mind was always working, watching, judging. He began to understand something dark and dangerous. In this new world, the line between good man and bad man was very thin. A badge could be worn by a killer. A criminal could act with honor. The rules were not simple anymore. It was this world that pulled John toward Dodge City, Kansas. Dodge City was loud. Dodge City was rough. Dodge City was alive. Cattlemen, gamblers, soldiers, and outlaws filled the streets. Gunshots were as common as church bells. Here, names that would one day fill history books walked the dusty roads like ordinary men. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, mysterious Dave Mather. John was not a legend. Not yet. He stepped into Dodge City as a stranger, another man with a gun, looking for his place in the chaos. But something about him caught the attention of the lawman. He was calm. He was steady. He did not shake when others panicked. Soon, John joined posses, riding with the law to chase train robbers and killers. The first time, he rode out at night with a group of armed men. The sky above them was black and silent. Only the horses' hooves and the soft clink of metal broke the quiet. John's heart pounded, but his hand stayed still. This was the life he had wanted. Risk, purpose, a chance to be more than a forgotten farm boy. But even here, in the company of lawmen, the line between justice and revenge was never clear. Sometimes they chased true criminals. Sometimes they chased men who had simply angered the wrong people. John saw fear in the eyes of those they caught. He saw how quickly a human life could be measured by a single choice, a single mistake. The real turning point came in January 1878. A train had been robbed near Kinsley, Kansas. The people were angry. The railroad was furious. The new sheriff, Bat Masterson, chose a small group of men to hunt the robbers. Among them was John Joshua Webb. This was not just another ride. This was a test. A chance for John to prove what kind of man he was. They followed tracks through snow and dirt. They questioned strangers. They rode for miles with little rest, the winter wind cutting into their faces. Finally, they found the gang. Guns were drawn. Tension filled the air like smoke. One of the outlaws, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, moved for his pistol. In that brief second, everything John Webb had become was put to the test. His hand flashed. His gun came up. He moved faster. Rudabaugh was disarmed and captured. In that moment, John stood clearly on the side of the law. He had helped bring down a dangerous gang. He rode back as a hero in the eyes of many. But the story did not end there. The man he had just arrested would later become his partner in crime, and a mirror of what John himself would turn into. As Dodge City celebrated the capture, John felt something strange inside. Pride, yes, but also a quiet, heavy question. Was he really different from the men in chains? Or was he only a few choices away from the same dark road? In the wild, shifting world of the West, heroes and villains often traded places, and without knowing it, John Joshua Webb had just taken his first real step toward the edge. The badge on his chest shone bright, but shadows were already gathering around his name. The capture of Dirty Dave Rudabaugh changed everything for John Joshua Webb. Before that, he was just another hard man with a gun. After that, people in Dodge City said his name with respect, and sometimes with fear. He had ridden with Sheriff Bat Masterson. He had helped bring down a train robber. He had moved faster than a dangerous outlaw. For the first time in his life, John felt a strange weight of fame on his shoulders. In Dodge City, that fame followed him wherever he went. When he walked into a saloon, men turned their heads. Some nodded to him. Some watched him with careful eyes, not sure if he was friend or threat. Women whispered his name. Gamblers sized him up. Other gunmen took note of how calm he stood, how steady his hands were. John did not brag. He did not tell stories about himself. He simply stood at the bar, drank in silence, and listened. But inside, a new feeling grew. I am not just a farm boy anymore. I am somebody. That feeling was both a reward and a danger. Life in Dodge City was never quiet. At night, the town glowed with lamps and noise. Piano music, shouting, laughter, and sometimes screams filled the air. John worked with the law. He rode as a deputy, backed up other officers, and kept order when drunk cowboys started trouble. He saw the best and worst of people. A young cowboy might be laughing with his friends one moment, and lying dead in the street the next, over a card game or an insult. John helped carry bodies. He helped calm crowds. He watched the blood soak into the dust. Over time, each death added another quiet stone to his heart, not because he did not care, but because caring too much hurt to survive in that town. John learned to lock his feelings away, but even as he wore the badge and enforced the law, he began to see something that bothered him. The law was not always fair. Sometimes the men they arrested were truly dangerous. Robbers, killers, men who would cut a throat for $1. But sometimes they were just poor and unlucky. They had no power, no friends in high places, no one to speak for them. John noticed that rich cattlemen got gentle treatment. Important businessmen could push people around. A well-dressed gambler might walk free while a dusty ranch hand went to jail for less. He did not say much, but deep inside, confusion grew. If the law can be bent, he wondered, what makes a man truly good or bad? Then came a new kind of job. A job that showed him another side of power. Railroads were fighting over land in the West. Wealthy men in suits were at war over tracks, tunnels, and mountains. They needed more than lawyers. They needed gunmen. During the battles over railroad routes in Colorado, Bat Masterson called on men he trusted. John Joshua Webb was one of them. Now, John was not just a deputy in a wild cow town. He was a hired gun in a corporate war. He rode with other tough men to protect the interests of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line. They guarded workers. They watched bridges and tracks. They faced off against armed men hired by the rival company. Shots were fired on lonely hillsides and in narrow canyons. Not over cattle, not over cards, but over business, money, and control. John stood with his rifle in his hands and realized something. The world was changing. Violence was no longer just chaos. It was a tool used by rich men far away who never risked their own lives. That thought did something to him. It hardened him even more. When the railroad struggle cooled down, John moved on again. This time, he headed to a town that made even Dodge City look calm, Las Vegas. New Mexico. Las Vegas was a new railroad town exploding with life. Saloons, gambling halls, and dance houses lined the streets. Money poured in, so did trouble. Each night, the town was filled with guns, whiskey, and danger. Fights broke out often. Men were killed and buried fast. If Dodge City was rough, Las Vegas was wild on a different level. But something else drew John there. In Las Vegas, he found familiar faces. Old names from Dodge City now walked the streets of this new boomtown. Doc Holliday, mysterious Dave Mather, other hard men and gamblers. These were not simple farmers, not quiet, family men. They were skilled, dangerous, and sharp minded. And John fit right in. Soon, John and Doc Holliday opened a saloon together. It was a smoky, noisy place. Poker tables, drinks, and men trying to forget their lives for a while. At the bar, Doc Holliday joked with customers in his dry-cutting way. John watched the door, watched the tables, and watched for trouble. One night, a drunk named Mike Gordon caused that trouble. He was angry about a woman and full of liquor. He walked out into the street and fired shots toward the saloon, shouting and cursing. In a town like Las Vegas, that kind of foolishness could not be ignored. Doc Holliday followed him outside. Words were spoken. Then a gun flashed. Mike Gordon fell dead in the street. The next day, the town buzzed with gossip. Some people said Doc was right. Some said he was too quick to kill. When Doc Holliday was taken to court, one of the key men to speak was John Joshua Webb. John took the stand. He told the story in a calm, steady voice. He explained that Gordon was drunk, armed, and dangerous. His words helped Doc walk free. For the first time, John was not just using a gun to decide a man's fate. He was using his words, his reputation. He felt the power of that. A few sentences from his mouth could shape how the law saw a man, guilty or not, safe or deadly. That power felt useful, but also heavy. As Las Vegas grew wilder, the town leaders knew they needed strong lawmen, someone who could stand up to killers, thieves, and drunken mobs. They chose John Joshua Webb. He was made town marshal of Las Vegas. New Mexico, thought the farm boy from Iowa, the quiet young man who once stared at dusty fields and dreamed of more, the deputy who helped capture train robbers, the hired gun for the railroad. Now he wore the top badge in one of the most dangerous towns in the West. On the day he took the job, John stood in the street and looked at the faces around him. Some were hopeful. Some were afraid. Some were already planning how to use him, or how to destroy him. Inside, he felt pride. He had climbed higher than he ever expected. But deep in his chest, another feeling stirred. A soft warning. A whisper he could not quite ignore. In a town like this, a marshal can become something else. He did not yet know it, but as he accepted that badge in Las Vegas, he was also stepping onto a darker path. A path that would slowly turn the lawman into an outlaw. and once he started down it, there would be no easy way back. John Joshua Webb now wore the badge of Town Marshal of Las Vegas, New Mexico. For a poor farm boy from Iowa, it was a big rise. He walked the streets with a gun at his side, a star on his chest, and the power to decide who stayed free and who went to jail. People stepped out of his way. Some greeted him with hope, others with tight jaws and cold eyes. At night, when he stood alone under the dim street lamps, he could feel the weight of the whole town pressing on his shoulders. Las Vegas was not just wild, it was boiling. Money, greed, fear, and violence all mixed together in its narrow streets. And into this boiling town stepped a man who would change John's life forever. His name was Hyman Neal, but almost everyone called him Hoodoo Brown. He was smooth, he was clever, he had a sharp mind and a calm voice. Hoodoo arrived in Las Vegas with a strange mix of talents. He knew the law, he knew gambling, he knew how to talk to rich men, and how to whisper things into the ears of dangerous ones. Soon he became Justice of the Peace, a man who could sign papers, judge cases, and make decisions that looked official, even when they were not fair at all. On the surface, it made sense. A town like Las Vegas needed lawmen, judges, marshals, deputies. But under the surface, something darker grew. Hoodoo Brown began to gather men around him, not soft men, not quiet clerks or gentle shopkeepers. He gathered gunmen, gamblers, and tough law officers, men who already knew how to use force, men who could look death in the face and not blink. Among them were names that had once stood beside John in Dodge City. Hard men, familiar faces. And now, at the center of this circle, was Marshal John Joshua Webb. They started calling this powerful group the Dodge City Gang. It sounded like a joke at first, a nickname, half serious, half playful. But slowly, the name began to fit too well. In the beginning, it did not feel like a crime. The gang sat around tables late at night, papers spread out, money counted, stories told. Hoodoo would speak in that slow, easy way of his. He would say things like, "We are just doing what the town needs. The court costs are low, we deserve a little extra. These men, we fine, are troublemakers anyway." He used soft words for hard acts, fees, fines, travel money. But behind those words, the truth was simple. They were using the law to fill their own pockets. If a stagecoach passed through town, the gang knew who was on it. If a herd of cattle came in, they knew how much money was flowing. Sometimes criminals were really caught. Sometimes they were blamed for things the gang themselves controlled. Men were arrested, fined, or scared into paying costs. Some never knew if they were facing the law, or a group of men who had learned how to hide crime under legal papers. John sat at that table, his badge shining on his chest, while money slid across the wood. He told himself it was fair. He told himself everyone in power did this. He told himself that if he did not go along, he would be pushed aside. But late at night, when the others left, he sometimes stayed alone in the office. He would look at his badge on the desk beside a small pile of coins and ask himself, when did this begin to feel normal? The town could feel the change. People whispered in corners of saloons. They said the marshal and the judge were too close. They said certain men never got punished. They said some crimes were never solved because the guilty ones were inside the circle of power. A poor man might be thrown in jail for a small act. A rich visitor might walk away clean after a quiet talk with the right person. Fear started to mix with anger. Las Vegas was no longer just a wild place. It was a town where many believed the law itself had become a weapon. And at the center of that weapon stood John Joshua Webb. Inside John, a conflict was slowly tearing him apart. He still chased real criminals. He still faced armed men in dark alleys and dusty streets. He was not a coward. He was not weak. But he was also now part of a machine that did not care about right or wrong, only profit and control. Sometimes he would arrest a man and bring him before Hoodoo. He would watch as Hoodoo turned the case into a chance to squeeze out money. A simple fight in a saloon, a drunk with the wrong friends, a stranger with a full wallet. Paper was signed, fees were added, and John's name went on the report. He was no longer just enforcing the law. He was supporting the system that had twisted it. One evening, After a long day, John sat alone in a quiet saloon, the night air cooling his skin. His drink sat untouched. From the doorway, a miner he had arrested earlier that week walked by. The man's eyes met his for a moment. There was no respect in that look, no fear, even just something worse, disappointment. It hit John like a gunshot. This was not fear of a strong lawman. This was the look a man gives someone he once hoped would protect him, and now no longer trusts. John looked away, his jaw tight in that small moment. He felt what he had become in the eyes of many. Not a hero, not a protector, something in between. A man with a badge and dirty hands. But the truly dark acts were still ahead. Rumors grew of robberies where the right people always seemed to know when the money would move. Talk spread of killings and lynchings where justice seemed too quick, too organized, too convenient for the Dodge City gang. John heard the whispers. He heard his own name mixed into them. At times, part of him wanted to walk away, to ride out of Las Vegas, to find some quiet town, and start over. But another part of him was trapped. Trapped by loyalty to the men he worked with. Trapped by fear of what would happen if he turned on them. Trapped by the taste of power he had grown used to. He was too deep now, too many days of looking the other way. Too many nights of silent agreement. Too many coins on the table with his fingerprints on them. The man who had once ridden with Bat Masterson to catch train robbers was now standing in a room where he might be the one profiting from crime. John Joshua Webb, the Marshal of Las Vegas, had crossed the line. He did not leap across it. He slid over it, step by step, choice by choice, dot and soon. One split-second decision in a smoky saloon would push him past any hope of return, and turn the uneasy lawman into a convicted killer. It happened on an ordinary night. No one in Las Vegas, New Mexico, woke up that morning thinking they would see a man die in a flash of gunfire, or watch their marshal fall from power. But that is how turning points are. They arrive quietly and leave scars that never really fade. The saloon was crowded. The lamps burned low. The air was thick with smoke. Cards slapped on tables. Coins clinked. Glass hit glass. Men laughed too loud. Others watched in silence. In the corner, a piano played a broken tune. Marshal John Joshua Webb moved through this chaos the way he always did, calm, steady, eyes open. He knew this room. He knew the faces. He knew that under the noise, danger was always waiting. That night, one of the men in the saloon was named Michael Killiher. He was a freighter. He worked hard, traveled long distances, and handled large sums of money. He was not a famous outlaw. He was not a gentle saint either. He had been drinking dot in his pocket or on his belt. He carried something else, a pistol. In Las Vegas, carrying a gun inside town was against the law. On paper, it was a simple rule. In real life, it was a line many men cross without thinking. But tonight, that rule was going to decide a life. Killiher did not sit quietly. He talked loud. He joked. He argued. The alcohol warmed his blood and loosened his tongue. Each drink pulled him further from reason. John watched him from across the room. To most people, it just looked like a lawman keeping an eye on a drunk. To John, it felt like watching a storm gather over dry land. He had seen this pattern many times. A man drinks, a man boasts, a man reaches for his gun. Then someone never sees another sunrise. As Marshal, it was his job to stop the storm before it broke. At some point, Killiher made it clear he was armed. Maybe the edge of the gun showed. Maybe someone whispered it to the Marshal. Maybe Killiher himself bragged about it. But soon, John and another officer stepped closer. They told him what the law said. No guns in town. They told him to give it up. Hand over the pistol. Let the night stay calm. For a moment, the whole saloon seemed to hold its breath. Killiher's eyes were hot with drink and pride. He was not just a man with a gun. He was a man with money in his pockets and friends at his side. He did not want to look weak. His voice rose. He refused. Some say he said something like, "I won't be disarmed. Everything goes." Those words were more than just noise. They were a challenge. John stood facing him, badge on his chest, hand near his gun, mind racing. He knew the law. He knew the rule. He knew his duty. But he also knew this. In a room full of fear, all eyes were on him, If he backed down, he would look weak. If he pushed too hard, he might kill a man. The world narrowed to a few feet of space between two men. Kelleher's hand moved. Was he reaching for his gun to show it, to hand it over, or to fire? No one can say for sure. What is certain is that John did not wait to find out in that split second. Years of training and instinct took over. His hand flashed to his weapon. The steel came up. The trigger pulled, bung, bung, bung. 3 shots. The noise crushed the piano music, the chatter, the laughter. The smell of powder burned the air. Kelleher staggered. 1 bullet in his chest, another, then 1 to the head. He fell to the floor, hard, and did not get up again. Silence crashed over the saloon. The drunk jokes died on people's lips. Cards lay forgotten on tables. Glasses froze halfway to mouths. For a brief moment, all anyone could see was a body on the ground, and the marshal who had put it there. John stood over Kelleher's body, heart pounding. Outwardly, he stayed rigid and controlled, like a lawman should. Inside, something trembled. He had killed before, in the line of duty, on the frontier, in rough fights where it was him or the other man. But this felt different. This was not on an open trail, not in a lonely canyon. This was under a roof, in the middle of town, under the watching eyes of dozens of people. He told himself he had done what he had to do. Kelleher had moved for his gun. A drunk with a weapon could kill anyone in that room. Still, a quiet question whispered inside him. Did I pull too fast? The town did not stay silent for long. News of the shooting spread across Las Vegas like fire in dry grass. By morning, everyone knew Marshal John Joshua Webb had killed Michael Kelleher in Goodlet and Robert's saloon. People took sides quickly. Some said it was clear. Kelleher went for his gun. The marshal had no choice. Others said no. They wanted his money. They pushed him. This was robbery dressed up as law. There were rumors that Hoodoo Brown knew Kelleher was carrying a large amount of cash, almost $2,000. People whispered that maybe this was no simple law enforcement. Maybe it was part of the Dodge City gang's quiet business. Whether those rumors were fair or not did not matter. What mattered was this. The town had already begun to hate the gang, and John's bullet had given them a target. John felt the change. Right away, where once he had seen respect in the eyes of the people, now he saw suspicion, anger, fear that was no longer mixed with admiration. Some still nodded to him in the street. Others turned away. The same badge that once shone like a symbol of hope now looked to too many like a mark of corruption. John tried to carry on with his duties. He wrote reports. He showed up in court. He walked his rounds. But the walls were closing in. The Kelleher killing would not be swept away as just another rough act in a rough town. The people wanted answers. Some wanted revenge. Soon, the law that John had served turned around and reached for him. He was charged with murder. The marshal who had once thrown men behind bars was now the man being led into a cell. Iron bars closed between him and the outside world. The sound echoed like a final warning. For the first time, John was not just asking himself whether he was a good man or a bad man in private. Quiet moments now, the whole town was asking the same question out loud. Was he a brave marshal who did what he had to do, or was he nothing more than one more outlaw, only this time wearing a star? As John sat alone on a hard bunk, staring at the walls of his own jail, he felt the weight of every choice he had made in Las Vegas. He had crossed the line, and now the line was coming back to claim him. The trial was coming, and with it, the chance that the land the people would decide his fate in a way he could not escape. The sound of the jail door closing behind John Joshua Webb was like the end of a gunshot, sharp, cold. Final. The man who once walked these halls as Marshal now sat on the other side of the bars. As a prisoner, he had locked up many men here. Now he felt the rough stone, smelled the damp air, and heard the iron clank in a very different way. For the first time, the walls did not protect him. They held him outside Las Vegas. New Mexico was boiling with talk in saloons. Men leaned close over their drinks. Did you hear? They charged Webb with murder. About time. The Dodge City gang has ruled this place too long. No, he's still a lawman. Kelleher went for his gun. He had it coming. Everyone had a version of what happened that night in Goodlit and Robert's saloon. Everyone had an opinion on whether the marshal had done his duty, or crossed a line that could not be forgiven. The people were not just judging the shooting. They were judging years of fear, anger, and quiet corruption. And they poured it all onto one man. John Joshua Webb. In his cell, John sat on the hard bunk, lost in a storm of thoughts. He replayed the shooting in his mind over and over. Kelleher's hand, the gun, the words, the split-second decision. In his head. It always happened too fast. No time to think. Just reflex. He told himself, if I had waited, maybe I'd be the one dead. But then another thought whispered, or maybe you were quicker than you needed to be. The badge on his chest had once made him feel strong. Now, thinking of that shining star made his stomach twist. Was he sitting in this cell because he had done his job, or because, over time, he had become part of something dark? And now the town wanted someone to pay. The day of the trial came. John was led from his cell in chains. People crowded outside the courthouse. Some curious, some hungry for punishment, some quietly worried, wondering what would become of their town if the marshal fell. Inside, the air felt heavy, like a storm before lightning. John stood in front of the judge. He looked around the room. These were not strangers. Many of these men had known him for years. He had broken up their fights. He had protected their families. He had also helped run a system that many now believed was rotten. Their eyes were not soft. They were tired, hard. Judging. Witnesses spoke. Some said Kelleher had been drunk and aggressive. They talked about his gun, his words, his refusal to hand over the weapon. Others hinted at something darker. They spoke about the Dodge City gang, about Hoodoo, Brown, about strange fees, about how certain men seemed protected while others were crushed. They did not have clear proof that the killing was a planned robbery, but they had years of anger lined up behind their words. Too many in that room. The bullet that killed Michael Kelleher was not just about one man. It was the last. Straw. John listened in silence. When it was his turn to speak, he kept his voice calm. He said Kelleher had gone for his gun. He said he had acted to protect himself and everyone in the saloon. He said he would rather live with the memory of shooting a dangerous drunk than see innocent people die. His words were simple, honest, as far as he understood himself. But honesty was not the only thing at work in that courtroom. There was also memory, bitterness, fear, a long list of wounds the town blamed on the circle of men around Hoodoo Brown, and John Webb was standing there as the face of that circle. The jury went out to talk. John sat waiting. He remembered the first time he had walked into Dodge City, unknown, hungry, full of hope and fire. He remembered the night he helped capture Dirty Dave, Rudabaugh, and felt like a true lawman. He remembered how proud he had been when they pinned the Marshal's badge on his chest in Las Vegas. Now, each of those memories sat in front of him like ghosts, watching, silent, unable to help him. The door opened. The jury came back. The room fell quiet. The verdict was read. Guilty, not just of a mistake, not just of heat of a moment action, guilty of murder. The words hit John like a blow to the chest. His jaw tightened. He did not shout. He did not break down. But inside, something cracked. The judge spoke again. Sentencing. Sentencing, in a clear voice, cold and final. The judge said John Joshua Webb would hang. The marshal who once enforced the law would die by the law. After the trial, John was taken back to the jail, but he was not the same man. Before, he had believed there might be a way out, that his truth would save him. Now he knew. The town wanted blood, and they had chosen his days turned into weeks. Each day in the cell was heavier than the last. John thought of his family far away. Did they know? Did they hear that their quiet son, the one who chased dreams out west, now waited for the hangman? He thought of the men he had worked with. Some still visited. Some stayed away. Hoodoo Brown himself moved carefully, like a man walking on thin ice. The Dodge City gang was breaking apart under the pressure. But there was one man who would not forget. John. One man whose life had once been in John's hands. Dirty Dave. Rudabaugh. Years before, John had helped capture him during the train robbery case in Kansas. He could have shot him. He did not now. Rudabaugh was an outlaw on the run. Violent, dangerous, feared, and yet, when he heard that John Webb was locked up and facing death, something inside him stirred. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the strange bond that sometimes grows between men who live with guns and risk. Whatever it was, Rudabaugh made a choice. He would try to free the man who once arrested him. One day, the calm of the jail was broken. Voices shouted. Boots pounded. A door crashed open. Rudabaugh and another man, John Allen, stormed into the sheriff's office with guns drawn. Their plan was fast and brutal. Overpower the jailer, snatch the keys, break John Webb out, ride hard and vanish into the open land. But plans that look easy in a dark saloon corner often bleed in the light dot in the chaos. Rudabaugh shot and killed the jailer, Antonio Lino Valdez. Blood stained the floor. The escape twisted into a mess. And in the middle of it all, John Webb did not get free. The jailbreak failed. Rudabaugh managed to escape. John Allen was captured. The town grew even more angry and afraid, and John stayed in his cell. The attempt to save him had only made things worse. Now, the people looked at John and saw more than a convicted killer. They saw a man whose friends would kill law officers to rescue him. Too many. This was proof. Proof that Webb was not just a lawman in trouble. He was one of the outlaws. Yet something strange happened too. The same act that darkened his name in town also showed that to at least one man, John's life was worth risking everything. It was a twisted kind of honor, a criminal's form of respect. In the quiet of his cell, after the failed escape, John sat with his back against the cold wall. The noose still waited for him. The town was still against him. The gang that once shared his power was breaking apart, each man looking out for himself. John Joshua Webb, once Marshal, once hero, now sat between two worlds. The world that saw him as a corrupt killer who deserved to hang, and the world of outlaws who saw him as one of their own. He did not fully belong to either. His story was not over. His death sentence would not go as planned. But as he closed his eyes in that dark cell, he did not yet know that fate still had one more twist for him, one that would pull him from the hangman's rope and throw him into the life of a hunted escapee. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The death sentence hung over John Joshua Webb like a shadow that never moved. Every morning, he woke up with the same thought. Is this the day they hang me? He counted the steps of the guards. He listened to keys turning in locks. Every shout in the hallway made his heart beat faster. Then, something changed. Lawyers argued. Letters were written. People in other places heard about the case. Some said the trial had been driven by anger. Some said the town was so tired of the Dodge City gang that they wanted a head on a rope. No matter what, pressure began to build outside the walls of the jail. And one day, word came down. John Joshua Webb's death sentence was changed. He would not hang. Instead, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. No freedom, no wide open sky, no bad, just stone bars and time that never ended. The rope was gone, but the cage stayed. When John heard the news, his feelings were mixed. Part of him felt relief. He would not die with a rope around his neck in front of a watching crowd. But another part of him felt something else, a heavy, empty sorrow, to live forever behind walls, to die in a cell, to grow old in chains, with memories as his only company. Was that really better? He sat on his bunk and stared at the floor. The boy who had once chased the horizon, the young man who had dreamed of adventure, was now a man doomed to live out his days in a box. Prison is a slow teacher. It strips away habits. It breaks routines. It makes time feel like a thick fog dot. John learned the sounds of the place, the rattle of chains, the scrape of boots on stone, the clank of iron doors. He learned which guards spoke kindly, and which enjoyed their power too much. He watched other prisoners, men who had killed, men who had stolen, men who had simply been too poor, too alone, or too unlucky. He saw fear in some eyes, rage in others, a dull, empty look in those who had already given up. He wondered which kind he was becoming. Then, fate twisted again. One day, the doors opened, and more prisoners were brought in. Dusty, hard-faced men. Rough eyes, scars. Among them was a man John knew very well. Dirty Dave. Rudabaugh, the same outlaw he had once helped capture in Kansas. The same man who had tried to break him out of jail and killed a jailer in the attempt. Now Rudabaugh, too. War chains. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other across the prison yard. Once, lawman and outlaw. Then, rescuer and condemned man. Now, both prisoners. Rudabaugh's mouth twisted into a small, crooked smile. "Looks like we both ended up in here, John," he might have said. The words did not need to be spoken. Their eyes said enough. Over the next days, the two men wound up side by side more often in the yard, in the mess hall, on work details. They did not talk all the time. But when they did, their words were straight and sharp. They spoke of the past, of Dodge City, of Las Vegas, of the night of the jailbreak. Rudabaugh did not apologize for killing the jailer. That was not his way. But there was a rough kind of loyalty in him. He had risked his life to free John once, and now he was trapped with him. It created a bond, twisted but real. As the months dragged on, a new thought began to grow in John's mind. At first, it was just a quiet breath, a far-off idea. I cannot die in here. He tried to push it away. He told himself that escape was madness, that the walls were too thick, the guards too many, the land outside too dangerous. But every time a cell door slammed, every time he saw the sky through a tiny barred window, the idea came back, stronger. I cannot die in here. And he was not the only one who felt that way. Other prisoners, hard men with nothing left to lose, began to whisper. Whispers turned into plans. Plans turned into attempts. The first big attempt was loud and bloody. One day, a group of prisoners, including John, Rudabaugh, and others, moved with sudden speed. Some had hidden weapons. A gun, a knife, a broken tool turned into a blade. Shouts filled the prison. Shots fired. Men ran. It was chaos. John felt a wild rush of hope for a moment. Freedom, open air. Horses, the world beyond the walls. But the escape fell apart. Guards answered with rifles. Orders flew like bullets. The prison locked down. One of the prisoners, a man named Thomas Duffy, was shot and killed. Others were beaten, dragged back, or pinned to the ground. When the smoke cleared, the walls still stood. The guards still held the keys. And John was still a prisoner. The failed escape came with a price. Punishment was harsh. Tighter rules. Less movement. More eyes watching every step. Some men lost hope completely after that. They sank into a silent, gray life, moving like shadows, waiting for time to erase them. But for John, something else happened. The taste of almost freedom did not kill his spirit. It sharpened it. He had seen how close they had come. He had felt that brief moment when the wall between him and the sky seemed thin. He knew now, if there was one way out, there might be another. But this time, it could not be noisy and obvious. It had to be slower, quieter, smarter. A small group of prisoners began to talk in low voices when guards turned away. They did not dream about gunfight. They did not brag about running down guards. They looked at stone, at mortar, at cracks too small for most people to notice. They studied the building itself. Walls are made by men. What men build, other men can sometimes break. In one part of the prison, they found it, a weak point, a place where the stone and mortar were not as strong as they should be. It was not much, just a little flaw, a small gift from poor construction. But in the hands of desperate men, a small flaw could become a doorway. The work began, slow, careful, silent. At night, when the prison quieted, when the guards grew bored and lazy, the men would start. A bit of stone here, a scrape of mortar there. They used anything they could. A spoon edge, a bit of metal, a broken tool lost from a work detail. Each tiny chip was a risk. If a guard walked by at the wrong time, if a sound echoed the wrong way, they could be beaten, chained, or killed. But they kept going, day after day, night after night. That little pieces were hidden. Dust was spread and kicked into the dirt so no one would see the growing hole. John's hands grew raw. His fingers ached. But he did not stop. At the words in his head pushed him on. I will not die in here. Slowly, very slowly, the hole appeared. At first it was only a crack big enough for a finger, then for a hand, then a small dark opening in the wall. They measured it with their own bodies. A shoulder, a chest, a hip. They needed it just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. By the time they were done, the gap was just inches larger, a tight, unforgiving opening, barely big enough for a desperate man to force himself through. But it was a path out. One night, the moment came, the prison lay thick in silence. The moon watched from above, one by one. The chosen men moved to the secret spot, Webb. Others whose names history barely remembered, but whose hearts beat as loud as any legends in that moment. They took a last look at the cells. Behind them, at the walls that had held them, at the lives that would end here if they stayed. Then they turned to the dark hole. They had carved with their own pain. The stone scratched their skin as they pressed through. Clothing tore, elbows and ribs scraped. But finally, they were through. They stood outside the prison walls. Under open sky, free air filling their lungs. John Joshua Webb, once sentenced to die, now stood in the night as an escaped convict. He had traded the hangman's rope and the life sentence for a new fate, to live as a hunted man, always looking over his shoulder. His life as a prisoner was over. His life as a fugitive had just begun. The night air felt different outside the prison walls. Colder, sharper, more real, for the first time in a long time. There were no bars between John Joshua Webb and the open sky. He stood there for a moment, chest rising and falling, feeling his heart slam against his ribs. Beside him, other men sucked in deep breaths of freedom. Among them was Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, eyes bright in the moonlight, mouth twisted into a wild, proud grin. They had done it. They had crawled through stone. They had slipped past guards. They had beaten the walls that were supposed to hold them for life. But this was not the end of their struggle. It was the beginning of a new kind of fear. Move, someone whispered. There was no time to stand and feel the night. They needed distance. They needed darkness. They needed to become ghosts before the prison even knew they were gone. The men hurried across open ground, staying low, hearts racing at every sound. A dog barked far away. A distant shout rose and fell. Every noise felt like a warning. They reached the edge of town and found their horses. Hidden earlier, with help from friends on the outside, in the dim light, Webb pulled himself into the saddle. The leather creaked. His hands, rough from stone, gripped the reins. He glanced once at the prison behind them, a dark shape against the sky. Then Rudabaugh's voice cut through the night. Let's ride. And they did. They rode hard. Dust rose behind them. The cold wind slapped their faces. The land stretched out wide and empty. Hours passed. Then more. The sky slowly turned from black to gray to pale blue. By dawn, they were miles away. Only then did they slow down. The horses were tired, sides wet with sweat. The men were sore, hungry, and bone-deep exhausted. But they were free. At least for the moment. They stopped in a lonely place, hidden by rocks and low hills. John slid down from his horse and sat on the ground, legs shaking, his muscles burned. His back ached, but pain felt small next to the simple fact that he was no longer inside a cell. Rudabaugh lowered himself beside him. For a while, they said nothing. The wind moved over them. A bird called in the distance. Finally, Rudabaugh broke the silence. You're welcome, he said with a rough half-smile. John let out a slow breath. He remembered the failed jailbreak, the dead jailer, the long months after, and now the second attempt had worked. I didn't ask you to risk your neck for me, John replied quietly. You didn't have to, Rudabaugh said. Men like us, we don't leave our own to rot. Those words hung in the air. Men like us, once. John would not have put himself in the same group as Rudabaugh. Lawman and outlaw, badge and wanted poster. Now, there was no difference. Both were hunted men. Days followed with the same pattern. Ride, hide, eat when they could, sleep when they had to. They headed south, then further south, trying to stay ahead of the news of their escape. John could almost feel the search behind them, posses forming. Telegrams sent, Descriptions passed from town to town. He had once been the man riding in those posses. Now he was the man they wanted to catch at night by the fire. The truth of that shift weighed on him. Flames lit his face with an orange glow. Shadows deepened the lines around his eyes. Rudabah talked icily of plans, routes, names of old contacts who might help. John listened more than he spoke. His body was free. His mind felt trapped between two lives. Sometimes he thought of the past. He remembered riding proudly beside Bat Masterson. He remembered testifying for Doc Holliday. He remembered the day they pinned a Marshal's badge on his chest in Las Vegas. He had wanted to be useful, to be strong, to be more than a forgotten farm boy. Now he was a man who had crawled through a hole in a prison wall and was running from the law. The old question came back to him again and again. Was I ever really different from the men I chased? As they moved deeper into the South, the land changed. New rivers, new towns, new faces in some places. People did not look too closely at a man's past if his money was good and his gun stayed quiet. Rudabah sometimes disappeared into towns, came back with supplies and news. He always brought rumors. News of the escape spreading, descriptions of dangerous prisoners now at large. Talk that the law wanted John and the others badly dead or alive. Sometimes Rudabah joked about it. They're making you sound important again, he would say. Like the old days, Marshal, but the title, Marshal, no longer felt like honor in John's ears. It felt like a painful echo of someone he used to be. After some time in Texas, the road led them even further south, toward Mexico. Down there, lines blurred even more. Outlaws from the U.S. crossed the border to disappear. Some found work, some caused trouble. Some vanished into the dust and were never heard from again. Life there was not easy. Strange language, unfamiliar customs, new dangers. Sometimes the locals were friendly. Sometimes they were suspicious of armed strangers with secrets in their eyes. John kept his head down. He did small jobs when he could, guard work, riding with herds. Anything that paid food and kept questions away. He was quiet, polite, and careful. But no matter how far he rode, he could never fully escape who he had been. On the other hand, was louder. He gambled. He drank. He found trouble and brought it close like an old friend. The two men, once bound together by escape and fear, slowly began to grow apart. They were both fugitives, but they wanted different things. Rudabah seemed to accept the outlaw life completely. No regrets. No looking back. John carried his past like a weight across his shoulders. One night, by a small fire under a wide, star-filled sky, their path quietly split. They argued about something small, at first supplies, money, the next town, but beneath the words lay something bigger, who they were now, and what they were willing to become in the end. The argument faded into silence. Rudabah stood, dusted off his hands, and looked down at John. You do what you want, Webb, he said, but men like us don't get clean. Remember that? Then he turned, whistled for his horse, and rode off into the darkness. John watched him go. The sound of hooves faded. The night closed around him. For the first time since the escape, he was truly alone. He sat there for a long time, staring into the dying fire. Part of him felt abandoned. Another part felt something else, a thin, fragile chance. Without Rudabah beside him, his name might spread less. His trail might cool. Maybe, just maybe, he could vanish. Not as John Webb, the Marshal, not as the escaped convict, but as someone new, someone no one was hunting. The thought brought a strange mix of hope and sadness to survive now. He would have to kill his own name, leave behind every piece of the man he had been, the farm boy, the deputy, the marshal, the prisoner. He would have to step into the world as a stranger, even to himself. As the fire finally went out and the stars watched in silent judgment, John lay down on the hard ground, thought the story of John Joshua Webb, known lawman and feared outlaw, was fading into the dark. Soon, another name would take its place, a name that would walk quietly across the land, carrying his past inside like a secret wound. But no matter what he called himself, he would always know who he had been, and the ghosts of Dodge City, Las Vegas, and that smoky saloon where Michael Kelleher died would ride beside him mile after mile, until the end. After the fire went cold and dirty, Dave Rudaball rode away into the night. John Joshua Webb sat alone under the dark sky. No posse, no partner, no badge dot, only a tired horse, a worn gun, and a heavy heart. For the first time since his escape, he had a real choice. Keep running as John Webb hunted Outlaw, or let that name die and become someone the world did not recognize. Either way, the man he used to be could never truly come back. Days passed as he rode north again, away from Mexico. The land changed slowly. Dry scrub turned to grass. Hot wind turned cooler. He crossed rivers, passed lonely cabins, and kept clear of busy towns. He stayed away from talkative strangers. He avoided saloons filled with sharp eyes and loose tongues. At night, by small, hidden fires, he thought about his life. He remembered his mother's tired face in Iowa, his father's worn hands in Nebraska, the feel of a fresh badge on his chest in Las Vegas. He remembered the sound of gunfire in the saloon, the echo of the word guilty in the courtroom, the cold stone walls of the prison. All of it felt like another lifetime now, a lifetime that belonged to a different man. Eventually, he reached Kansas again. He did not ride into Dodge City. He stayed away from old ghosts. Instead, he found work the only way a man like him could, quietly, simply, without drawing attention. He worked as a teamster, driving wagons, hauling goods, helping move supplies where people needed them. Long days, early mornings, blisters on his hands from rough wood and rougher roads. Nobody asked too many questions. Nobody greeted him with, "Marshal Webb, is that you?" Because here, he was not Marshal Webb at all. He was just another tired man trying to earn his next meal. But there was a problem. As long as he carried the name John Joshua Webb, he was never truly safe. Wanted posters might still exist. Old stories might still be told. A drunk somewhere might remember his face. All it would take was one sharp-eyed person to say, "Hey, don't I know you?" So, slowly, carefully, he made a decision. The name John Webb had to die. He needed a new one. Sometime after leaving Kansas again and moving deeper into the South, he finally let that new name settle onto his shoulders. Samuel King. No middle name. No old history. Just two simple words. Samuel King did not have a record. He had no wanted posters. No trials. No prison escapes. He was empty on paper. A blank page. For a man who had lived a life full of scars, that blankness felt strange. Almost like a lie he had to tell himself every morning. Samuel King drifted again, until he found work in a small place that did not ask about his past. Winslow, Arkansas. It was not a wild cow town like Dodge City, not a boiling railroad boom town like Las Vegas. It was quieter, the kind of place where the biggest sounds were trains rolling through, hammers hitting rails, and the simple, steady noises of work. Here, Samuel became a railroad worker. He lifted, he hauled. He sweated in the heat and shivered in the cold. He learned the schedules of the trains. He learned the faces of other workers. Men who, like him, carried private pains they didn't talk about. To them, he was just Sam. A bit quiet, tough, kept to himself. No one looked at him and saw a former marshal. No one saw a convicted killer or an escaped prisoner. And for a while, that was enough. But even in this quiet life, he could not escape himself. Sometimes, at the end of a hard day, Samuel would sit alone. He would watch the last light fade over the hills, listen to the distant echo of steel on steel, and memories would come back. He would see Michael Kelleher falling in the saloon. He would hear the judge's voice. He would feel the tight grip of prison walls. Other times, he remembered different moments. Riding beside Bat Masterson, giving calm testimony to help Doc Holliday, standing tall in the street with a badge on his chest, truly believing he was on the side of the law. Those memories hit him hardest, because they reminded him that he had not been born a villain. He had become one, slowly, step by step, in a world where right and wrong were always tangled together. The men around him in Winslow did not know any of this. They only saw a hard worker, a man who showed up on time, did his job, and did not complain. He did not drink much. He did not start fights. If anything, he seemed tired more than anything else. Tired in his bones. Tired in his eyes. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. He was only in his mid-30s, but life had aged him more than years ever could. Then, one day, the enemy that came for him was not a bullet, not a rope, not a badge, or a judge. It was smallpox. A silent sickness moving through people, jumping from body to body, ignoring guns, titles, and past deeds. Samuel King fell ill. At first, it was just fever, sweat, aches. He tried to work through it. He had lived through gunfights, trials, and prison escapes. What was a bit of sickness? But it grew worse. His body shook. His skin burned. Spots appeared. Pain spread. Soon, he could not work. He could barely stand. He was put aside, laid down, left to fight the sickness with nothing but his own strength. As he lay there, drifting in and out of fever dreams, his past and present blurred together. In one moment, he was John Webb again, hearing the word Marshal. In the next, he was a prisoner, feeling stone under his hands. Then he was Samuel King, a nobody railroad worker in a place far from all of that. Faces moved in and out of his fading awareness. His parents, his many brothers and sisters, Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, Michael Killer, some angry, some sad, some silent. He did not know if forgiveness existed for a man like him. But as the fever grew, the questions slowly lost their edges. On April 12, 1882, in Winslow, Arkansas, the man known there as Samuel King died of smallpox. He was only 35 years old. There was no big crowd, no grand final scene, no famous last words, no badge, no wanted poster being pulled down. Just a sick man, far from his birthplace, far from the towns where his name had once carried power, closing his eyes and slipping away. In Winslow, people buried Samuel King as just another working man. They did not carve John Joshua Webb on his grave. They did not list his deeds. They did not know his history. To them, he was simply gone. But somewhere, newspapers still carried small notes about him. A line in the Dodge City paper quietly reported the death of J.J. Webb from smallpox. A few men who had known him might have paused for a moment when they read that, remembered the young deputy with the steady hands, the marshal who stood tall, the man whose choices had pulled him off the narrow road of justice and into the deep mud of corruption and crime. Then they folded the paper and moved on. The West was changing. New names were rising. Old ones faded fast. In the end, John Joshua Webb's life was not a simple story of hero or villain. He was both: a brave deputy who faced gunmen without flinching, a hired gun in a railroad war, a marshal who let greed and power pull him into a corrupt gang, a man who killed in a saloon and paid with a trial, a sentence, and a prison escape, a fugitive who tried to live quietly under another name, and finally, a lonely worker who died far from home, with no one around him knowing who he truly was. His story is not just about the Wild West. It is about how a man can change, how power can twist, how choices add up, and how, in the end, even the most feared gun can be stopped by something as small and silent as a fever. The legend of John Joshua Webb faded, but the questions his life raises are still alive. Can a man outrun his past? Can someone who falls so far ever truly find peace? Those answers now rest with him. Somewhere under the quiet ground of an unmarked story, the story of a lawman who became an outlaw and died as a stranger named Samuel King. Years after the death of the man called Samuel King in Winslow, Arkansas, the world kept moving. New towns grew. Old trails faded. Rails spread farther across the land. People married, worked, fought, and died, and the name Samuel King slowly disappeared into the dust. But the name John Joshua Webb did not die so easily. It lived on. Not in the town where he died, but in stories told far away, in saloons, in newspapers, and later, in books. In Dodge City, old men sometimes sat by bar counters and remembered. They remembered a quiet young deputy who rode with Bat Masterson, a man who moved fast when it mattered, a man who once faced down Dirty Dave Rudabaugh and took his gun without a tremble. Webb, they would say, yeah, he was steady, could depend on him in a fight. In their memories, he was a lawman, a good man, mostly brave, serious, useful. They did not see him as a villain to them. He was part of a time when the West was wild, and only a few men stood between order and chaos in Las Vegas. New Mexico, the story sounded very different. There, people remembered the Dodge City Gang. They remembered hoodoo. Brown, they remembered fear. Old stories whispered of fines that never seemed fair, of men who got away with crimes, of money changing hands in the dark. And when they spoke of Webb, they did not talk about a brave deputy. They spoke of the Marshal who worked with a corrupt judge, the man who shot Michael Killaher in the saloon, the prisoner who was sentenced to die. To them, he was not a hero who fell. He was a symbol of what happens when the law itself becomes a weapon. Then there were the newspapers, printed words that turned people into shadows on a page. Some articles called him notorious. Some called him a former lawman turned outlaw. Some simply listed facts. Born in Iowa, served as Marshal, convicted of murder, escaped from prison, died of smallpox. No feelings, no pain, no doubts, just simple lines of ink that could never carry the full weight of his life. Time rolled on, new heroes rose, new criminals took the headlines. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, others whose names grew larger than life compared to them. John Joshua Webb's story was smaller, quieter. It slipped into the background. But every now and then, someone digging through old records would find his name. A line in a report, a mention in a memoir, a brief note in a dusty newspaper. J.J. Webb, former Marshal of Las Vegas, New Mexico, died of smallpox under the name Samuel King. The writer might pause. Who was this man, really? He was not simple. That was the problem. Some Wild West figures are easy to turn into legends, all good or all bad. But John's story did not fit in a straight line. He was both. A man who had worn the badge with pride, a man who had risked his life chasing criminals, a man who let himself be pulled into greed and corruption, a man who shot a drunk freighter in a saloon and never truly escaped that moment, a man who dug through stone to escape prison, only to die quietly in another town under another name. How do you tell that story in a way people can accept? In some ways, his life became a quiet warning, not shouted from rooftops, not written on posters, but whispered between lines. He showed how easy it is for a man with good intentions to slide into darkness, not with one big, evil choice, but with many small choices, looking the other way, taking a little extra, listening to the wrong voice, saying just this once, again and again, until one day he realized the line he thought he would never cross was far behind him. Imagine him for a moment, not as a name in a book, but as a real man walking down a street. Boots on a dusty road, hat pulled low, eyes tired but alert. He is not smiling, he is not laughing. He is thinking about the path behind him, thinking about how a farm boy from Iowa became a deputy in Dodge City, how that deputy became a marshal in Las Vegas, how that marshal became a prisoner, how that prisoner became a railroad worker named Samuel King. He is wondering if there was a point where he could have turned back, a night when he could have said no. A moment when he could have walked away from Hoodoo Brown's table, a breath of time when he could have lowered his gun instead of firing it. But life does not give a man the power to rewind, only to remember. And what about the people who crossed his path? Bat Masterson likely remembered a capable deputy. Doc Holliday might have remembered a partner who stood by him in court. Dirty Dave Rudabaugh remembered a man worth risking his life to free. Michael Killaher, if he could have spoken from beyond, might have called him something very different. To each person, John was not the same man. He was a different shape, seen through a different window. That is how real lives are. No one is just one thing. Years later, when writers and historians tried to piece together the truth, they found contradictions. Some sources called him a brave lawman. Others focused on his crimes. Some small details changed from telling to telling. Even in death, John remained caught between two images. The hero with the badge, the outlaw with blood on his hands. The truth was not in choosing one or the other. The truth was in the uncomfortable space in between, a place where many real people live. Slowly, the West became legend, movies, novels, stories by campfires. Gunfighters became larger than life, with cleaner lines, clearly good, clearly bad. But behind those clean lines were real men like John Joshua Webb, men who were brave and weak at the same time. Strong and broken, honorable and selfish. Men who made choices they could never take back. If someone standing in a quiet room today reads about John Webb, they might feel something unexpected, not just judgment, but recognition, because most people, in their own way, know what it is like to stand at a crossroads, to feel pulled in two directions, to choose badly and then live with the weight of that decision. John's story is not just about the Wild West. It is about the human heart, about how easy it is to lie to ourselves, to say, I'm still one of the good ones, even as our footsteps lead us down darker roads. In the end, history did not build a big statue for John Joshua Webb. No famous monument, no carved stone in a well-known cemetery. His grave is quiet. His name is scattered across paper in bits and pieces. But his life, with all its twists and fall, still asks a hard question to anyone who hears it. When the world pushes you, when power tempts you, what kind of person will you become? The man who began as a simple farm boy never knew that, long after his death, his story would still be asking that question. Two people he would never meet, in times he could never imagine. His life was over, but the lesson inside it was not. And in the final part of this story, that lesson will come into full light, showing what John Joshua Webb truly leaves behind at the story of John. Joshua Webb did not end with the sound of gunfire, or the crash of a prison door, or even the quiet last breath of a sick man named Samuel King in Winslow, Arkansas. It continued in a different way, in memory, in questions, and in the uneasy feeling people get when they hear his name and try to decide, was he a hero? Was he a villain? Or was he something far more human and far more troubling? In history, some men are easy to label. There are outlaws who never wore a badge. There are marshals who never broke the law. But John Joshua Webb lived between those two extremes. He began as a poor boy from Iowa, one of 12 children, with nothing but hard work, dust, and a restless heart. He grew into a young man who wanted more than a small farm and a quiet life. He rode west, worked hard jobs, learned the rhythm of the land, taught himself to be calm in danger. When he reached Dodge City, he stepped into a place where legends walked like ordinary men. There, he took his first real steps toward greatness and toward ruin. As a deputy, he helped hunt down train robbers. He moved fast, aimed steady, and brought in dangerous men alive. Other lawmen trusted him. They saw him as strong, brave, and reliable, standing beside names like Bat Masterson and Doc Holliday. He seemed like one of the good ones. For a while, he truly was. But the West was not a place that stayed simple for long. The more power he gained, the more he saw how flexible the law could become in the hands of clever men. In Las Vegas, New Mexico, he rose higher than ever. Town Marshal, it sounded like victory. It sounded like respect. Yet that badge placed him right next to Hoodoo Brown and the Dodge City Gang, a group of men who mixed law and crime until no one could clearly see where one ended and the other began. They sat at tables late at night. They spoke of fees and costs and keeping order. But under those soft words lay something hard. Greed, control, power. John did not fall all at once. He slipped. One small compromise, then another. One silence when he should have spoken. One coin taken when he should have refused. He stayed close to that circle, to close, until one night in a smoky saloon, with a drunk freighter, a pistol, and a split-second choice, everything broke. The killing of Michael Kelleher was like a mirror-shattering dot to John. It was a fast decision in a dangerous moment. To the town, it was the final sign that the law itself had turned on them. The trial, the guilty verdict, the death sentence, they were not only about one man lying dead on a saloon floor. They were about years of fear and anger toward the Dodge City Gang. Don became the face of all of it. Later, the rope was traded for a life sentence, and the life sentence was traded for a desperate escape through stone. But no matter how far he ran, he could not escape the truth that followed him. He had once stood for justice. Then he had stood beside corruption. Then he had stood in a courtroom as a convicted killer. Those three images never stopped chasing him. As Samuel King, he tried to live a quiet life. He worked with his hands. He kept his head down. He did not wear a badge. He did not command fear in that simple work. There was something almost like peace, but it was not the peace of a clean conscience. It was the peace of a man who was too tired to fight himself anymore. Inside, he still carried the faces, voices, and choices of his past. He carried the weight of Kelleher's death, the echo of the jury's word, guilty, the feel of cold stone on his fingers as he dug his way to freedom. No new name could erase that. So what does his story mean? It shows that a person can begin with good intentions and still lose his way, not because he wakes up one day and decides to be evil, but because he keeps saying yes when he should say no, because he stands beside the wrong people, because he learns to accept small wrongs until they do not feel wrong anymore. John Joshua Webb proves that the most dangerous fall is often slow and quiet. A drink at the wrong table, a favor done for the wrong man, a bit of extra money taken just this once. And suddenly, the man in the mirror is not who he thought he was. His story also shows something else. How the world can turn on someone. When he wore the badge, some people saw him as a hero. When he sat on the witness stand for Doc Holliday, the court trusted his word. But when he stood accused, when the town finally had a chance to strike back at the Dodge City gang, he became the perfect target. He was guilty of many things. He was also a product of a broken system and a brutal time. Both things can be true at once. That is what makes his story uncomfortable and real. In the end, his death was not dramatic. No last stand in the street. No duel at high noon. Just a bed, a fever, and a quiet last breath in a small Arkansas town. The law did not catch him. No posse brought him in. Smallpox did what bullets and judges could not. It stopped him. In that simple, silent ending, there is a strange kind of balance. A man who once held life and death in his hands was finally brought down by something he could not shoot, escape, or outtalk. What remains of him now? Not his body, not his grave. What remains is his story, a story of rise and fall, of honor and corruption, of courage and weakness. A story that does not tell the listener what to think, but invites them to decide, was he a good man who went wrong, a bad man who wore the mask of a hero, or a human being caught between both, like so many others, in less extreme ways. Somewhere today, someone hears his name for the first time. They learn about the boy from Iowa, the deputy in Dodge City, the marshal in Las Vegas, the prisoner, the escapee, the sick worker in Arkansas. They feel something stir inside. Maybe a warning, maybe a question, maybe both. Because his life quietly asks, if power and fear and greed knocked on your door, would you stay on the right side of the line? No one can answer that easily, not honestly. So, as this story of John Joshua Webb closes, his journey does not vanish. It stays as a mirror for anyone who listens, a mirror for anyone who has ever wondered what they might do if pushed by hunger, pride, anger, or fear. The farm boy, the lawman, the outlaw, the stranger called Samuel King, they were all the same man, and his life, with all its broken pieces, still speaks today. It says, be careful who you stand beside, be careful what you let become normal, because one day you may look back and realize you crossed the line long ago. If this story were told in a video, the screen might fade to black now, the music might grow quiet, and somewhere a listener might sit in silence for a moment, thinking not just about John Joshua Webb but about themselves.